'Cause you can't, you won't, and you don't stop. Or when you can't, you won't, and you don't stop. Mike D coming down for sure, shot.
First normative models that we're going to look at are consequentialist models. So again, they concentrate on the outcome. We're going to look at two of them, ethical egoism and utilitarianism. So let's get into it. As we've mentioned, consequentialists or teleological theories say that the ethical thing to do depends upon the consequences of the action or decision. So what we do is we predict and analyze the consequences of the choice facing us. If those consequences are good, then it's right. If the consequences are bad, it's wrong. So really you can think about this in terms of the phrase, the ends justifies the means. We're worried about the results, the ends, not how we get there, the means. We're going to look at ethical egoism and utilitarianism. Our first model, ethical egoism, is reasonably simple. An ethical egoist perspective suggests that the ethical thing to do is what is right or good for the decision maker. That's the criteria. Does it result in a good outcome for the person, the ego? Okay. So a personal ethical egoist is really only talking about themselves, whereas an impersonal egoist is saying everyone should act that way. We're not going to distinguish between those two approaches. The main thing that I'd like you to think about is that our criteria for working out whether something's ethical is whether it's good for you or not. Now, if it is good for you, right, if it's positive for you, then you are ethically obliged to carry out that action. And it would be unethical not to do it, no matter what else happens to other people or what you've got to do to get that outcome. Okay, so it can be a little bit confronting when we first start these theories because by definition, it's ethical to do what the model suggests. That's what the model is saying. And that is a bit counterintuitive for some people who don't think about ethics along the lines of the particular model we're dealing with. Particularly this model, right? To say you absolutely have to do what's good for you and that's the only consideration. That's what this model says, okay? So let's have a look at the slide here. So ethical egoists claim the right action for someone is the thing which maximizes their own long-term self-interest. I really want to emphasize this, long-term self-interest, because long-term versus short-term can have a hugely different effect. And I think a lot of times when people think about ethical egoism, they're thinking about like the immediate effect rather than a long-term effect. I'll get into that in a minute, but I want to emphasize it's about your long-term interest. You can be either have a perspective that is either a personal ethical egoism, which contends that you should act in your own interests, or we're kind of dealing with the impersonal egoist more, which we're saying this theory says everyone should act in their own interests. So what we do is we look at what can happen into the future. We try and predict and analyze what would happen if we did something. And then we look at what it means for the individual. If it's got positive consequences, then we have to do it. We're morally obliged to take this action. Okay, so this slide is very, very important because what it's really dealing with is some of the misconceptions about ethical egoism. So ethical egoism is not about simple hedonism or particularly short-term pleasure or happiness, right? It could also be about self-actualization, right? So think about having to sacrifice maybe you've got to train or practice if you're in the arts in order to get a good skill, etc., right? So in the short term, that could be a bit of a negative in the short term if you don't like training or you don't like practicing. But if you win the championship or do a great production, in the long term, overall, it's good for you, okay? So we're not talking about short-term pleasure or happiness necessarily. We're talking about overall what would happen. It also means that we may consider others, right? because it might be in our interests to work with others. So it might be more important to always be honest, right? Because then people will trust you. And that will be to your long-term benefit, even if lying in the short term might get you a little bit ahead in the short term. Overall, being honest might work. Okay, so you have to look in the long term. You can take other people's reactions and the long-term impact into play when we're thinking about whether it's in your interests. So in that way, it's not always about the easy option. Making sacrifices might lead to long-term benefit. Ethical egoism does have some positives, right? It recognizes that you're the best person probably to work out what's good for you. It also recognizes that your interests are important and should be part of any calculus to work out what's ethical. It also provides a way to say that, look, working cooperatively and becoming trustworthy might actually align with your self-interest per se. And if we can get systems that do that, things will probably work a lot better. So there are some very positive aspects that come out of this particular, even simple framework. Now, I'd really like to take a moment to also make a key point that we're distinguishing ethical egoism from psychological egoism. See, psychological egoism is a descriptive theory, not a normative one. We're dealing with the normative theory of ethical egoism, right? Psychological egoism suggests everyone acts in their own self-interest. It's describing what's happening. It's not saying what people should do. So some people sometimes say ethical egoism is justified because psychological egoism is true. But that doesn't always hold. We know lots of people who make huge sacrifices. Often for family members, some people give their lives to benefit others, say in warfare or emergency situations. So I don't know whether psychological egoism always holds. The other problem that arises with psychological egoism is it becomes self-referential. So what do we mean by that? Well, if you argue that everyone is always motivated by some form of self-interest, then you can't predict what people are going to do as a result of that. And so we've got a simple example here where person A will risk their life to rescue someone because they want praise, and person B doesn't want to risk their life because they don't want to die. So in the two cases, we get two vastly different outcomes predicted by the same theory. So the theory has no predictive or normative use for us because we can't use it to predict what we could or should do. Now again, I want to distinguish this idea of psychological egoism, which might be the way things are, even though there's question marks about it, from ethical egoism. Ethical egoism is making a different argument. It's saying it's ethical to only consider your own self-interest. You've probably guessed by now that some people have some problems with this theory. Okay, in fact, some people would say it's probably not a good theory of ethics because it doesn't consider one of the key hallmarks of ethics. Right? Remember, in the last module, we discussed the idea of ethics being the relationship between the self, what's good or right, and others. Okay, in this one, we don't consider like the outcome on others. It's totally the self. So some people would argue it may not even be an ethical theory or model in and of itself because it fails to meet that essential element of the definition. So in many ways, it conflicts with the essence of morality, right? Looking at the relationship to others. We can also see that it's partial and biased. It prioritizes you, right, over everyone else. And so it's subjective and becomes a matter of individual taste. So it comes very close to ethical relativism, okay, because what's ethical will change by the individual's preference set. And one of the probably biggest problems is you can ignore blatant wrongs. Acts would be justified, racial discrimination, etc., because it's in your interest. So that's it. That's a pretty simple model to beginners. Ethical egoism. Do what's in your own self-interest. But as we saw, that's got some problems. The particular problem of it not considering other people, which is why we move on in the next video to have a look at classic utilitarianism.